of the skull, and then we'll move past all of the dry lab and then go into some of the wet lab structures. So for the teeth, I have the skull here. Let me just center that real quick. So when I look at the teeth, I remember just the numbering order of the teeth. So 2, 1, 2, 3. There's two incisors, one canine, two premolars, three molars. Remember, you have four sets of these. So you have a right and a left set on the maxilla and a right and a left set on the mandible. So let me show you. So if we zoom in here to see our teeth on the maxilla, right, you have two incisors, so two of the 2, 1, 2, 3, two incisors. You have one canine, so 2, 1. You have two premolars, 1, 2, and then you have three molars, 1, 2, 3. So 2, let me go back. Yeah, okay, so 2, 1, 2, 3. And then you have one on each half of the maxilla and the mandible. So you have 2, 1, 2, 3 here, 2, 1, 2, 3 here, 2, 1, 2, 3 on this half, and 2, 1, 2, 3 on the bottom half as well. So if I was to do the same thing, 2, 1, 2, 3. So you have your incisors, your two incisors, your one canine right here, your two premolars, and your three molars. Now that we have that down, let's move on to the dry wet lab structures. All right, so now that we're looking at the muscles of facial expression, the first muscle we are going to be looking at is frontalis. Right, so this is frontalis. Helps you raise your eyebrows. Frontalis. Next muscle we'll be looking at is orbicularis oculi. Oculi means eye, right? That's orbicularis oculi. And then we have orbicularis oris. So orbicularis just means it encircles something. So orbicularis oculi is encircling the eye or the orbit. Then we have orbicularis oris, which is encircling the mouth or the oral cavity, the oris. Then next we have zygomaticus major. Right, that would be this muscle here, zygomaticus major. Right, you can see one on the left and the right side. Right, so this is the zygomatic bone, and it's going all the way to the crest of the mouth, all the way to the lateral portion of the mouth. And then similarly, we have another muscle called depressor anguli oris. So zygomaticus major is one of the muscles that function in helping us smile, while depressor anguli oris helps do the opposing function and deals with frowning. So you see it attaching to the lateral side of the mouth, and it attaches all the way to the mandible. So these muscles do opposing functions. They help in doing opposing functions. Okay, now that we have that, remember this would be depressor anguli oris as well. So bilateral muscles. The next thing we're going to be looking at is buccinator. Right, this muscle comprises the cheek of your mouth. So if I would, let me just click on the maxilla on each side and then the mandible, so we can get a better view. Right, so you can see how this is comprising your cheek. Right, the muscles comprising your cheek or the insides of your mouth. we can see that, we're going to move on to the last muscle of facial expression, platysma. Right? It's this very long muscle that spans the neck. Right? It's very obvious and noticeable. Platysma. Right, so that is the last muscle. That is the last muscle. Now we're going to move on to, let me remove, okay, yeah. Let me move on to the next section. All right, so now that I have the skull open, we're going to go into the nasal cavity. Most of the structures we can see just looking at the bony structures, but I do want to show you an image of the nasal cavity with mucosa, and a bunch of other structures, and then I'll just come back to this bony skull structure, and we can go over some of the sinuses and associated structures. So let me just do that real quick. Okay, here we go. All right, so this is how your nasal cavity looks like. There's a lot of mucosa wrapped around the surfaces of the openings. Let me just remove that real quick. All right. I'm just removing things just so we can get a better image. There is a lot of vasculature and neurovasculature, so I just want to go to the bony skull so we could just see everything more clearly. But this is your nasal cavity. Let me move on to the bony skull without any of the other structures. All right, here we go. So first structure we're going to be looking at is the nasal septal cartilage. Right, so this is the nasal septal cartilage. All right, it divides the nasal cavity into two separate passages. Right. And it also forms the lower anterior portion of the nasal septum. So now that we have that, we're going to move on to some of the conchae. Right, singular concha. So if I look at the nasal cavity from the posterior, it makes it a lot easier to see the conchae. Right? Right now we can really see, get a good view. All right, okay. So, right, this would be the inferior nasal concha. Let me move this. That's the inferior. This would be the middle. And then this is the superior. Right, so inferior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and then middle, and then superior. So superior nasal concha, middle nasal concha, and inferior nasal concha. All right, I just want you to be able to see those divisions. So superior, middle, inferior, singular concha, plural conchae. And then I'll also get out the ethmoid bone just so we can see that a bit clearly, and then we'll move on to the sinuses. Let me remove that. Let me press that. Let's get this. Let's look at this phenol too. Okay. here. Right, so vomer would be on the bottom here, and then we have the ethmoid bone on the top, and then you'd have your nasal septal cartilage right here. So vomer would be right here. Let me just select all of them again so we can get a better image. Okay. Okay, so here we go. Okay, so vomer would be here, and then nasal septal cartilage would be in the front, or the septal nasal cartilage. Right, you have your ethmoid bone making up the superior aspect of the nasal cavity, and then you have your maxilla bone making up the inferior aspect. Right, and then we can see our chondra. You have your inferior nasal chondra, middle nasal chondra, and then your superior nasal chondra. I know it's a little bit hard to see. So you have your inferior. Right, this is your middle. And then you have your superior nasal chondra up here. Now that we have that, let's move on to the sinuses. So you have three sinuses that we're going to talk about. Three, but I might as well add the fourth one because I'm pretty sure we're going to be talking about that in a different region, but I'm just going to talk about all four of them now. So your sinuses, let me go to so your maxillary, ethmoid and sphenoidal-sinuses, and your frontal sinuses, they warm air before it enters your lungs, and it also creates hollow regions inside of these bone structures to make your skull lighter. So instead of having a skull that's completely solidified with bone, that would be a lot heavier than having regions of the skull that are empty and that air can flow through. So if I press on the frontal bone and I press the examine, it did not work out properly. There we go. Okay, so why is it examining everything else? One second. This thing is not working as it should be. One second. All right, so we're back. There we go. Okay, so with this, right, we're looking at the frontal bone. If I solidify it again, that's the frontal bone. If I ghost it, you can see the frontal sinuses here. So let me just get this going. Okay. You can see the frontal sinuses right here. Frontal sinuses, hollow regions inside of the bone. Right? Frontal sinuses. Now if we move on to some of the other sinuses, we have maxillary sinus. So as you can see, you see another hollow region inside of the bone. That would be this here and this here. Right? Maxillary sinus. maxillary sinus, maxillary sinus. Now we're going to move on to the two other sinuses. We have an ethmoid and a sphenoidal sinus. So ethmoid and sphenoidal sinus. So let me solidify that. Let me solidify that. So if I press on the ethmoid, remember the acronym my left eye sees, so maxillary, lacrimal, ethmoid, and sphenoid. So if I click on inspect, if I ghost it, right, you can see all of the sinuses inside of, well, all of the little openings inside of the ethmoid sinus. Right, all of these little openings, go from this, so all these little openings inside of the ethmoid bone, right, these would comprise and make up the ethmoid sinus. I know this just looks like the ethmoid bone, but there's openings, right, there's little small openings inside of the bone. So it's not completely solidified, it's hollow, right? And these openings make up the ethmoid sinus. So we have that. Now we're going to move on to the sphenoidal sinus. So that's the ethmoids, solidify that. And then we're going to examine, inspect, and then ghost. Now we have the sphenoidal sinus, right? So this, you can see this little, well, not little, it's a lot bigger than the openings for the ethmoid. You just see one large hollow region, and this is the sphenoidal sinus. Right, sphenoidal sinus. And if I examine it again, solidify it, right? If we look actually inside of it, you can kind of see the opening inside of the bone. Right, this large opening, that is the sphenoidal sinus. I hope I'm giving you a good image of that. But this region inside of the sphenoid bone, sphenoidal sinus. All right, now let's move on to the oral cavity. All right, so now that we're going to move on to the oral cavity, the first muscle we're going to be looking at is directly under the chin, mylohyoid. So there's a muscle that we're going to be learning next week, the anterior digastric. But directly under the anterior digastric muscle is going to be mylohyoid. Right, so connect from the mandible to the hyoid bone. So now that we have mylohyoid down, it's a bilateral muscle as well. So you're going to have one here. So on both sides. So mylohyoid. If I click on the mandible and then the hyoid bone, right, mylohyoid. One here, one here. Matter of fact, I might as well just show you how it looks on both sides. Okay, there we go. Mylohyoid. Mandible, hyoid, mylohyoid. The next muscle we're going to be looking at is, well, I guess the next region is going to be the soft palate and the hard palate. So if I click on this here, so if I click on this region here, right, this would be the hard palate, so comprising the maxilla, which is this bone, and then the palatine bone here. So the first 2/3 of the hard palate are here, comprising the maxilla bone and the last 2/3, the last third. So first 2/3, last third is the palatine. So the maxilla and the palatine bone make up the hard palate. And then we have the soft palate directly after. Right, so we have the hard palate, first 2/3 maxilla, last third palatine, and then we have the soft palate. I think it's better to see this from this view. All right, so we're looking at so now we're looking from a sagittal view. Before we were looking from more so of a transverse view. So this is the maxilla, this is the palatine, right? This comprises the hard palate, first 2/3, last third, and then everything after that is the soft palate. Right, so from here to here makes up the soft palate. So let me just ghost this real quick. Right? So everything. So after we move posterior, right? When we're moving posterior from palatine, right? That's comprising the soft palate. Right. So this is the uvula right here. This region here, that's the uvula. And directly on the tongue, separating the anterior and posterior regions, would be sulcus terminalis. So that would be about here. All right, so the anterior and posterior tongue have two different origins of development, and they also have two different innervations. So that's why we have anterior tongue and posterior tongue, and separating anterior and the posterior tongue would be the sulcus terminalis. Now that we have that down, so remember the uvula is here, right? This is the hard palate, and then the soft palate is here. Right? And this is our tongue. So let me remove that. We also have genioglossus, which is this muscle right here, right? One of the major muscles for the tongue. Now we're going to move on to the arches. So if you look at the uvula, right, which is right here, right, this is our soft palate. There's two arches. So we have the palatoglossal arch. So going from the soft palate, right, this is our soft palate. Going from the palate, soft palate, to the tongue or the glossus, we have the palatoglossal arch. So you see this arch here? This arch is the palatoglossal arch. And then, so if you see that arch there, palatoglossal arch. And then going from the uvula to the pharynx, we have the palatopharyngeal arch. So do you see the differences? This is one arch, this is the second arch. Right, so this is the palatoglossal. You see it going from here all the way to the glossus. So this arch right here. And then you have the palatopharyngeal arch. That's this arch right here. It's going from the soft palate to the pharynx. So one's going to the pharynx here, one's going to the glossus here. So palatoglossal arch, palatopharyngeal arch. So palatoglossal, palatopharyngeal. So one arch, two arch. So these are both two arches that start at the same region but end at two different regions, hence glossal and pharyngeal. So to we have all of that down. Now we're gonna move on to the pharynx. I guess we're already here, so we don't have to worry about moving. So the first bone, hyoid bone, we went over that when we were looking at mylohyoid, right? It's suspended. Right? It's also known as the floating bone, right? Suspended by ligaments and things of that nature. Um, and then now we're gonna look at the pharynx. Okay, so I'm gonna remove these muscles here and then get them back later, just so we can see the compartments of the pharynx a lot easier. Okay. All right, let me just remove this. Well, yeah, let me just keep it like that. So we have three different regions of the pharynx. So we have the nasopharynx. So if I show that again, right? So inside of this region, right? So this is the nasopharynx, right? So in this entire region, comprising this entire region, right? Nasopharynx. Right? This is the nasal cavity, but this region here is the nasopharynx. Right? Moving from the nasal cavity to the pharynx, nasopharynx. Right? So that's why when I select here, nasopharynx. Right? So remember, this region is the nasal cavity. And then once I'm moving from the nasal cavity to the pharynx, nasopharynx. And then from there, right, so this was the nasopharynx. From there, we have the oropharynx. So, right, this region here, behind the oral cavity, going into the pharynx, is the oropharynx. Right, so oropharynx. So, nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then from there, we have the laryngopharynx. Right, so this is our laryngopharynx. So once we move into our larynx, so once we're moving into the region where our larynx is, we're in the laryngopharynx. And right, this goes back into to form our esophagus, and then we have our trachea here, right? After we pass the larynx, we have our trachea. But right, so we have the laryngopharynx moving into our esophagus, and then we have our larynx here. Right, this region is our larynx, moving into our trachea. Right, larynx is also known as your voice box, and we'll move on into those structures next week. So larynx, laryngopharynx is right here near the epiglottis, and then that moves into the esophagus, and then the rest of your digestive system. Now that we have that down, we're going to move on into auditory tube opening. So give me just 1 second. All right, so looking for the auditory tube opening, it's also known as the eustachian tube. So I'm going to cover everything back here and move outward a little bit, right? So our auditory tube opening is located inside of the nasopharynx. So if I go to the nasopharynx here, right? So this is our nasopharynx, oropharynx, and then laryngopharynx. But if I remove the mandible portion here, you can see your auditory tube opening in the back here. This is our auditory tube opening. You can see it going all the way to the middle ear. Right, so the middle ear is an somewhat enclosed region. So in order to equalize the pressure with the outside environment, we have this auditory tube opening, right? That connects with your nasopharynx and then your nasal cavity and then the outside environment. And this helps stabilize pressure inside of your middle ear, right? This is where when you're in an airplane and you're going up and you feel that pressure, that's where you're feeling that pressure inside of the middle ear. And it stabilizes via this region, the auditory tube opening. And you can usually pop your ears to feel some type of relief, but that is via this structure. Now that we have that, I'm pretty sure that comprises everything for the pharynx, and we're going to move on to the eye. I just realized I forgot about two structures, the first of which being the superior cervical ganglion. And you can see the superior cervical ganglion here, right? The right one, the left one. Right? Sympathetic neurons, they innervate structures of the head and the neck, and they synapse at this ganglion. Superior cervical ganglion. You can see it right behind one of the branches of carotid, the internal carotid. You can see it right there. Then we have the pharyngeal constrictor muscles. I would have to search them up here. Constrictor. Right, all of these muscles would be pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Let me just. Right, these would be your pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Right, and I can show you those regions in the donors, but generally these would be your pharyngeal constrictor muscles. Okay, now let's move on to the eye. So for the eye, most of these structures are going to be here besides the tapetum lucidum. That's only in non-human animals, non-human vertebrates, and they use the tapetum lucidum to be able to reflect light during the night, so they can have better night vision. Humans don't have this structure, so tapetum lucidum is going to be the only structure that we don't see when we're going over the eye shortly. All right, so now we're looking at the eye, the layers of the eye. So the first layer, that white outer layer, the sclera. Let me just see if I can. Yeah, so perfect. There we go. Okay, so if I just remove that. Okay, so that white outer part, right? That's what we're seeing here. That is the sclera. Right, so if I remove that, that white outer part is the sclera, what I just removed. And then if I remove that, you have the choroid. So the choroid is usually black, um, but here it's shown to be this red pigment. So the choroid is here. So the choroid is black for non-vertebrate animals, but here it's red. So choroid, non-human vertebrates. Let me say that. You have the choroid, and then we have the retina. All right, this is where light is being focused onto for us to see. Tapetum lucidum we're not going to see. Right, we have the vitreous body, right, connected to the lens. Let me just get the external eye. That might be better because we already saw the other structures. Okay, there we go. So remove the cornea. We saw the cornea. Right, this is the first part that light is going to hit once it reaches the eye to focus it on the retina. So the cornea and the lens both deal with those functions. You have the aqueous humor in front of the lens and the cornea, so the aqueous humor. And then we're going to have the vitreous humor behind the lens. So in front of the lens, aqueous humor; behind the lens, vitreous humor. So we're going to remove the sclera, that white part. We have the choroid here, and then we have the retina, right? This is where light is being focused onto, right? And then we have a whole bunch of vessels here. We have the vitreous body connected to the lens, and then we have our iris here, and then right behind the iris we see ciliary body, ciliary body. So we remove the ciliary body. You see the zonular fibers. Let me try. I'm trying to remove that. There we go. Okay, so you see the zonular fibers here, otherwise known as the suspensory ligaments, right? And these are connecting. These are connecting from the ciliary body and attached to the lens. That's the lens. To remove that. So if we remove the lens, right, and then we have our pupil right in the middle. That's that black circle you see right in the middle of your eye, pupil. And then these other structures we don't need to worry about. Besides the macula luta and the fovea, don't worry about this. This is where light is being directly centered on, right? So this is your point of greatest. This is your point of greatest optical acuity. Basically, your best point where you can see, right? All the light is trying to focus onto this region. And then you have your blind spot. Your blind spot is where you can't, or where there's no rods or cones, so you can't see anything here, right? So your blind spot is here where the optic disc is going to be located. So your blind spot right here, your optic disc connects to the optic nerve, right? Optic disc connects to the optic nerve, and then the optic nerve, we see it connect to the optic chiasm. I'm going to show you that here, right? So you saw the optic nerve, so that was the optic nerve we were looking at previously. And then we see the optic chiasm right here. Optic nerve, and we see the optic chiasm right here. All right. And the last thing I want to go over is the muscles of the eye. So the extraocular muscles is the last thing I want to go over. Everything else, I'm just checking the list right now to make sure that we've gone over everything else. Yeah, so we're just going to go over the extraocular muscles.